So we talked about the narrative and the objective touching, and so I wanted to touch on that again. Is that like I I understand C.S. Lewis's argument, and I'm even inclined from time to time to think, well, I've got the choice between believing two impossible things. I can either believe that in the world is constituted so that God took on flesh and was crucified and died and rose 3 days later, or I can believe that human beings invented this unbelievably preposterous story that stretched into every atom of culture. And it isn't obvious to me that the second hypothesis is any easier to believe than the first, because the more you investigate the manifestations of the story of Christ, the more insanely complicated and far-reaching it becomes. So I read Ion, for example, and for all of those who are listening, if you want to read a book that will completely make you insane, then you could read Jung's Ion. And it's a study of Christian symbolism in astrology, which doesn't sound particularly dangerous, but or even particularly necessary to read, I suppose. But Jung describes the juxtaposition of astrological and Christian symbolism, and it's a brilliant book, and it's terrifying because he outlines the concordance between the levels of symbolism over several thousand years. And it's obvious when you read the book that no one plotted this. It's not a conspiracy. Whatever's going on to make that concordance occur isn't something that we understand. And it seems to be best understood as one of these situations where the narrative and the objective touch. The saturation of Christianity with fish symbolism, Jung associates with astrological movement of into the house of Pisces. And so he describes how a drama, so ancient people saw a drama played out in the sky, and that was a projection of their imagination. And that projection contained symbols that were associated with the emergence of Christianity. And so you can see in that the alternative explanation is that there's this unfolding of a symbolic landscape over centuries or millennia that's part of human biological and cultural evolution, but that starts to touch on the religious anyways when you describe it in those terms. Like it's the operation of a natural cognitive process, let's say natural/cognitive process, that supersedes any one individual or any one culture. And so I've never seen a critique of Ion. I think people read that book and they think, oh.
Well, one of the things that, for example, we talked about just before, the idea that, the idea of Christ being a dying and resurrecting God, and, that's really actually not the case. If you actually just look at the story of Christ, and not just the story in scripture, but let's say the whole story as it kind of developed in tradition and kind of melded together. In the ancient world, you had this idea of gods that went down into the underworld. Either that went down for some reason to visit, or went down to save somebody even, or or died and then rose again. But that's actually not the story of Christ, because if you understand the full tradition of the Christian story, we think that Christ died, went into Hades, and then destroyed death. And he pulls everybody out of death. And then that's it. Like, what other story are you going to tell after that story? You have a story of someone who dies, goes into death, and then destroys death, and then that's it. That's the thing with Christ's story, that every story, every aspect of his story reaches the limit of storytelling, and it's impossible to go beyond it.
Right, that's right. Well, even from a psychological perspective, that's correct. And that in itself is a kind of miracle. And so you're stuck in some sense constantly having to choose between miracles. It's like, okay, it's a figment of the human imagination. Fine, but it's the limit figment in multiple ways. How did that happen?
And also, but as soon as you start to think that the world is made of attention, the idea of just a figment of somebody's imagination, especially just a figment of someone's imagination, which happens, like you said, over thousands of years within communities of thousands of people, it just becomes a ridiculous statement. It it doesn't mean anything. It's like,
Yeah, it only means something if you assume that, and Jung pointed this out, it only means something. To say it's a figment of imagination and have that brush it aside means that you think that imagination is nothing. And Jung pointed out constantly that you should not attribute nothing to the psyche. It's what you depend upon. It's the ground of your existence. It's not nothing. It's the thing that you take for granted more than anything else.
So anything that you can recognize as a story will definitely be manifesting patterns that you can recognize. And so they can't just be brushed aside from the most insane conspiracy theory to the most, like childish fairy tale. Anything that manifests itself as a pattern of story that you can recognize has a certain level of value, has enough level that if you pay attention to it, you actually can gather some nuggets of how the world works and how the world lays itself out. And that's why, like, if I do symbolic interpretations, I can do it for scripture, but I can also do it for some Marvel movie or some video game or whatever it is, because that's just for you to even recognize something as having being, it's already part of that world. It's already manifesting these patterns.